power of presidency. John F. Kennedy once said, "We were just worms in the House. Nobody paid much attention to us nationally." He said this after serving 3 terms in the lower chamber of the U.S. Congress. Kennedy then served 7 years in the Senate. But being a senator did not quench his thirst for power either. When he explained in 1960 why he was running for president, he said, "Being a president provided powers that no senator could ever dream of."
Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts, Democrat, throws his hat in the presidential ring at a Washington press conference.
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. The presidency is the most powerful office in the free world.
American politics has often been defined by the tug-of-war between legislative and executive branches. This, at times, has led to stalemate, exposing the dysfunction in Washington and inflicting profound political and economic costs on the country. Presidents far more respectful of the Constitution than Donald Trump have tried to advance their own agenda by sidestepping Congress and expanding their own authorities. But no president has pushed the limits of presidential powers like Trump has.
You look at the rules of the Senate, even the rules of the House, but the rules of the Senate and some of the things you have to go through, it's really a bad thing for the country, in my opinion. They are archaic rules, and maybe at some point we're going to have to take those rules on, because for the good of the nation, things are going to have to be different. You can't go through a process like this. It's not fair. It forces you to make bad decisions. I mean, you're really forced into doing things that you would normally not do except for these archaic rules.
How much power should a president hold?
Well, in my opinion, a president should hold just enough power as is necessary to get the job done. The second article of the United States Constitution dealing with executive power is rather vague on the president's duties. He is chief executive officer. He is commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States. He appoints high government officials and diplomats and military officers. He receives ambassadors. He makes a report to the Congress on the State of the Union, and so forth. But I think, in my view, too many presidents over too many years have increased their powers at the expense of the Congress and at the expense of the judiciary, the other two co-equal branches of the American government.
Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution explicitly specifies how much power a president should have, but presidents have pushed the envelope on their authorities.
The first most egregious president that did so was Andrew Jackson, when he defied the United States Supreme Court and forcibly removed the Cherokee. And his famous quote was, "The Supreme Court has their decision, I'll let them enforce it." And of course, Congress then, probably for the first time in its history, abrogated its responsibility of oversight. They should have impeached President Jackson. So there probably is the genesis of imperial presidential power and an abuse of presidential power, and the Congress not exercising its oversight.
Presidents have frequently tested the limits of their powers on national security and war powers. But Trump is flexing his muscle almost entirely to protect himself.
In my view, Trump is a narcissist. He believes the world revolves around him, and he believes that other people think that the world revolves around him. He doesn't understand real, true power. He doesn't understand political power. And it's a question as to whether he really understands business power.
According to the Constitution, Congress is the superior power of the government, not the president. But Congress has increasingly abrogated its oversight responsibilities over the past 6 decades.
And the most noticeable example of that is the war powers and the budget. Congress handed the budget process. The president was supposed to submit a budget, yet originally Congress was supposed to do the budget. But in the war powers, Congress has passed these very mealy, very weak authorizations for use of force, when in fact the Constitution says Congress shall have the ultimate authority over war powers. Presidents, both Democrat and Republican, have been able to wage war, aggressive war, break international law by essentially usurping the war powers provisions of the U.S. Constitution, and Congress, both Democrat and Republican, have let them get away with it.
Trump has continuously broken the norms of how a president should behave. He is asserting power by any means possible. Trump demands loyalty from Republicans in Congress and has helped drive his opponents from office, notably Senators Bob Corker and Jeff Flake. He has fired civil servants and his staff when they disagree with him. He calls reporters and journalists enemies of the people when they criticize his policies. He instills fear to get his way on controversial issues, including the Muslim ban and his border wall.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists.
Trump is ready to give the nation its longest ever shutdown, and he uses a national emergency declaration to redirect money that Congress has authorized.
Have you considered using emergency powers to grant yourself authorities to build this wall without congressional approval? And second,
yes,
on
I have.
Mexico, you have?
Yes, I have. And I can do it if I want.
So you don't need congressional approval to build the wall?
No, we can use them. Absolutely. We can call a national emergency because of the security of our country. Absolutely. No, we can do it. I haven't done it. I may do it. I may do it.
I wouldn't say he's expanded the powers of the presidency. He's abused the powers of the presidency. His use of the emergency declaration, sure, it's statutorily permissible, but it sets a dangerous precedent, a very dangerous precedent. And his underlying, let's understand, Trump's underlying ideology.
Trump also frequently attacks judges that have issued rulings he doesn't like. Last November, when Judge John Tiger of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit ordered the administration to accept asylum claims, Trump called the decision a disgrace. He also dismissed Tiger as an Obama judge and blasted the Ninth Circuit.
The Ninth Circuit, we're going to have to look at that because every case, no matter where it is, they file it practically. I mean practically, for all intents and purposes. They file it in what's called the Ninth Circuit. This was an Obama judge, and I'll tell you what, it's not going to happen.
The courts are supposed to be the bulwarks of the Constitution. They depend on the administration to enforce their decisions. Why is Trump seeking to bend the rules and expand his personal powers?
He does this because he thinks he can get away with it. He believes he has no constraints upon him. He believes that his word is law and that he can act as he pleases because he is president. And he doesn't really understand the extent and limits of power.
Trump's leadership style indicates his desire for absolute power. Whenever he is met with opposition, he spouts lies and issues threats to fuel public resentment, perhaps even violence to crush that opposition.
Donald Trump's abuses of the presidency are going to continue until Congress effectively checks that. Now, I will say the Democrats, since they have taken over the House, they are exercising almost every tool in the constitutional toolbox in an attempt to check the executive. But absent a Democratic Senate or some Republicans in the Senate with some courage of conviction like the Republicans during the Nixon administration, it's not going to be effective. So what we're headed for is more abuses, more hateful rhetoric, more narcissism, more racism, more Islamophobia, and we're going to see a 2020 election the likes that America has never seen before. And quite frankly, I'm fearful of what is going to happen in that 2020 election.
Critics say Trump's entire presidency has jeopardized the means of democracy in order to preserve and expand his authorities. In a scathing report earlier this year, Freedom House, a renowned watchdog group, concluded that Trump poses an existential threat to democracy. The report criticized Trump for assailing essential institutions and traditions, including the separation of powers, a free press, an independent judiciary, the impartial delivery of justice, safeguards against corruption, and the legitimacy of elections. Others have also sounded the alarm over the future of democracy in America.
I think that the reason that I issue this book as a warning is that we can't normalize the kinds of things that are going on in this country now, kind of hoping that everything will go away. And so I do think what we need to watch very carefully is what happens to the press. Democracy depends upon the freedom of the press and not being called the enemy of the people. respect for the judicial branch of government, specifically because of the kinds of allegations that have been made by them, by President Trump about them, and then whether he is acting more and more as though he's above the law.
America's founding fathers were troubled by the notion of a despotic demagogue who could undermine the rule of law. That's why they created a system of government based on separation of powers between branches and an independent judiciary. Presidents, most notably Trump, have been trying to disrupt this system. Should the American people be worried about Trump's authoritarian tendencies?
I think they should. I think that Donald Trump is trying his best to shut off criticism of his policies, to shut off questioning of his policies, to shut off analysis of his policies. And unfortunately, neither Congress nor the American news media, the press, the television, the radio, whatever, really go into what Trump is doing, really do not question his statements, do not analyze his actions, and do not seek a basis for his actions. And this is what should worry the American people. The American people themselves are too accepting of Trump's decisions and statements. They huff and they puff sometimes.
Power of presidency. Trump has embraced strongmen and dictators in places like Saudi Arabia. He has stood by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in the war in Yemen and the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, despite the outcry in Congress and around the world.
They're buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of things from this country. If I say we don't want to take your business, if I say we're going to cut it off, they will get the equipment, military equipment and other things from Russia and China.
Trump's support for Saudi Arabia has been a point of tension with Congress since the murder of Khashoggi last year. Lawmakers from both parties have slammed Trump for not condemning the Saudi leadership for orchestrating the killing. The Senate has voted to stop the U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. But Trump continues to stick with his ally in Saudi Arabia.
It's very clear now the issue with Saudi Arabia, it's just absolutely atrocious that the President of the United States, the so-called leader of the free world, will embrace a regime that executes and beheads people in public, wages genocide in Yemen, bombing a poor third world country into submission. And Donald Trump considers that to be brazen, considers that to be masculine. He is referred to the Saudi royal family as very good people.
Despite boasting about his deal-making abilities, Trump has shot himself in the foot more than once. The recent government shutdown, the longest in U.S. history, is the latest example of Trump sounding assertive but gaining little, if anything, in return.
To me, the government shutdown was an utter failure of executive leadership, and I think it's an example of just how totally incompetent management can needlessly hurt millions of people. It's not what all of a sudden everybody's going to get their checks and we're right back on. This has damaged the country, and it'll take a while to recover.
But Trump has shown no inclination he is willing to revise his style, and that carries risks.
His own administration produced a damaging report showing that we face what they called substantial damage to the U.S. economy, environment, and human health from climate change. And you know what the president said in response? I don't believe it, he said. How can you possibly not believe it?
Some congressional Republicans, especially those from swing states, are beginning to distance themselves from the president.
The issue, of course, is what will happen for the 2020 elections, both in the general elections for president and for members of Congress. So what's going to happen, I think, is more and more people seeing that Trump is a liability, even in his own party, they will simply back away from him. They will not support his policies. They will be very quiet. They will be very silent. And he will lose support in key areas, I believe.
However, Donald Trump still controls the base of the Republican Party. Though support for the president has softened to some degree, his base has yet to sour on his presidency.
Donald Trump still controls the base of the Republican Party. About 85 to 89% of the Republican Party has bought into this jingoism and xenophobia. And so the senators and congressmen on the Republican side are scared of primary challenges. They're afraid that when push comes to shove, if they don't support Donald Trump.
The White House and Congress have historically crossed swords over foreign policy, especially when it comes to war powers. According to the U.S. Constitution, only Congress can declare war, but presidents have time and again broken this rule. Harry Truman engaged in the Korean War without a congressional declaration of war. Dwight Eisenhower used the CIA to carry out black operations in other countries.
You can go through history. The one president that probably got away with the most egregious oversteps was Dwight D. Eisenhower with his black operations throughout the world, including the 1953 coup, U.S.-sponsored coup by the CIA in Iran. The lead officer of that was a son of an ex-president, Kermit Roosevelt, the son of Theodore Roosevelt. So it seems to be in the blood sometimes. We can just go on and go on.
Lyndon Johnson launched a bombing campaign against North Vietnam and sent 100,000 combat troops to the war without consulting Congress. Richard Nixon secretly put troops in Laos and needlessly prolonged the war in Vietnam for another 4 years. George W. Bush used his presidential power as commander-in-chief to wage a so-called war on terror.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
Congress abrogating its war power authority during the George W. Bush administration, that's almost 20 years ago, and yet that war powers resolution is still used as a basis for the United States to go around the globe and engage in black ops and droning civilians and engaging in war, all under a 20-year-old congressional resolution in which very few members of Congress who were there are still sitting in Congress today. That resolution should be canceled.
Barack Obama promised to curtail Bush's overreach, but he launched bombing raids against Libya without congressional approval and asserted the right to kill American citizens overseas.
When a U.S. citizen goes abroad to wage war against America and is actively plotting to kill U.S. citizens, and when neither the United States nor our partners are in a position to capture him before he carries out a plot, his citizenship should no more serve as a shield than a sniper shooting down on an innocent crowd should be protected from a SWAT team.
President Trump also overstepped his authority when he ordered missile strikes against Syria without congressional consent.
My fellow Americans, a short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway.
There are historical precedents showing how presidents lose when they assume too much power. After the Korean War had hit a stalemate, Americans began to see their country's involvement in the conflict as a mistake. Truman found himself in a political predicament, and his approval ratings plunged in the 20s. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan took a toll on Bush's popularity as well.
These abuses never would have happened if Congress would have enforced its own authority over the executive. In each and every case, Congress abrogated its constitutional responsibility.
Foreign policy experts warn that the U.S. could be barreling toward another unnecessary conflict in the Middle East based on misleading logic. The Trump administration's policy on Iran echoes the failed Iraq strategy.
In theory, the so-called Iran deal was supposed to protect the United States and our allies from the lunacy of an Iranian nuclear bomb, a weapon that will only endanger the survival of the Iranian regime.
Ever since Trump unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, he has ramped up his belligerent rhetoric to accelerate hostility. The U.S. stands alone in the breach of the agreement, bullying allies with threats of sanctions to come on board with its position. Foreign policy experts warn that Congress must act urgently to prevent Trump from repeating the mistakes of his predecessors.
What's happening now is that with each little bit of accretion of power, sending American men of war into the Mediterranean to fight the Barbary pirates in the beginning of the 19th century without a declaration of war from Congress, on up to the latest Trump escapade and his attacks on Iran and his efforts to bring about a war with Iran, I think is something that the American people should look askance at and should do their very best to tame and to use the courts and the Congress and the news media and civic action to put links and controls and chains on unbridled executive power, or we will wind up with a dictatorship, a king that we don't like, that we have no choice over.
Congress was meant by the Founding Fathers to be the superior branch. But in today's America, the executive acts and Congress reacts. In most cases, a fractious Congress scrambles after the fact to put a check on the president, often to no avail.
A lot of things are offensive. Your questions are offensive.
U.S. President Donald Trump has made clear that he's not bound by ordinary political checks and conventions. This has caused a rift between the White House and the legislative body in the U.S. time and again. But in every scenario, from declaring a state of emergency for his proposed border wall with Mexico to causing the largest government shutdown in U.S. history, which ultimately hurt the American worker, Donald Trump has boasted about the economy. The one factor which may come back to haunt him in 2020 when he runs for a second term.
There are lots and lots of warning signs that we have the mother of all bubbles in the economy. There are tremors, and the response of the government has been to remove regulation, to diminish the control and regulation of businesses and banks. They've been relaxing the controls continuously.
According to Ian Williams, who covered the previous financial crisis, the state of the U.S. economy is in danger. He's surprised why more people don't talk about it.
You sell the shares, you pay the banks. You buy the shares, you pay the banks. Would you put your the faith of the world economy, the fate of the world economy, in the hands of Donald Trump? That's the big danger. And it doesn't just face Trump, you know. Ask not for whom the stock exchange bell rings, it rings for us all.
U.S. President Trump recently called on the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates and once again interfered in their process, his latest attempt to put the traditionally independent central bank under his control. Donald Trump knows that his re-election campaign in 2020 will be a referendum on the country's economy. Forecasters say the best-case scenario for the U.S. economy is a slowdown in the coming year, although the Trump administration disagrees, as opposed to a full-blown collapse. For We the People, I'm Susan Madaris in New York.
What I'm trying to say is Donald Trump is presidential. He just happens to be running on the wrong continent. In fact, once you realize that Trump is basically the perfect African president, you start to notice the similarities everywhere, like the level of self-regard.
I say not in a braggadocious way. I've made billions and billions of dollars. I made a tremendous amount of money. I'm really rich. I have a great temperament. They love me anyway. I don't have to do this. I've done an amazing job. I was born with a certain intellect. God helped me by giving me a certain brain.
I bet that's the one time that God's like, I don't need the praise. It's cool. That's you. I'm cool.